The sun bled crimson across the Wyoming horizon, casting jagged shadows over the endless prairie, as if the land itself wept for what was to come. Amos Creed knelt beside the lifeless body of his favorite mare, her once glistening chestnut coat now dulled by dust and death. His calloused hands trembled as they brushed over the bullet wound in her side, the blood still warm, pooling into the cracked earth. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and betrayal, and Amos's heart pounded with a rage he hadn't felt since the war. Somewhere out there, the rustlers who'd raided his ranch were riding free, their laughter echoing in his mind like a taunt. This wasn't just a theft, it was a violation, a wound carved into the soul of a man who'd already lost too much. His eyes, weathered by years of squinting against the sun, scanned the horizon for answers, for justice, for something to hold onto before the darkness consumed him entirely. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the fight for what's right, please hit that like button, leave a comment, share this story, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts, because stories like Amos's remind us that even in the harshest moments, hope can still find a way. Amos Creed was no stranger to hardship. Born in the shadow of the Civil War, he'd grown up watching his father carve a life out of the unforgiving Wyoming plains, only to lose it all to drought and debt. By the time Amos was 16, he was an orphan, scraping by as a hired hand on ranches across the territory. But he had dreams of a ranch of his own, where he could raise horses, build a family, and live free from the whims of cruel men and crueler fates. It had taken 20 years of sweat, sacrifice, and sleepless nights, but by 1887, at the age of 36, Amos had done it. Creed's Hollow was his sanctuary, a sprawling 500 acres where his horses roamed free, their hooves drumming a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the land itself. His wife, Clara, had been his anchor, her gentle smile a balm for every bruise the world inflicted. Their daughter, Lily, just 7 years old, was his reason to keep going, her laughter filling the quiet spaces of his soul. But the West was a jealous mistress, and peace, Amos learned, was a fragile thing. The trouble began in the spring, when whispers of rustlers started drifting through the saloons of Laramie. At first, it was just a few head of cattle here, a horse or two there, vanishing into the night like ghosts. But as the months wore on, the thefts grew bolder. Entire herds disappeared, fences were cut, and ranchers woke to find their livelihoods gutted. Amos had heard the stories, but he'd been cautious, hiring extra hands to patrol his land and keeping his best horses close to the homestead. He'd thought he was safe. He'd thought wrong. The night before, under a moonless sky, the rustlers had come. They'd slipped past his men, cut through the corral, and taken 6 of his finest horses, including Mara, the mare who'd carried him through blizzards and battles, who'd nuzzled his hand like she understood his every sorrow. When Amos found her that morning, shot dead just beyond the boundary of his land, something inside him broke. It wasn't just the loss of the horses, it was the violation, the deliberate cruelty of it. Mara hadn't been stolen, she'd been killed for sport, left to bleed out as a message. And Amos knew exactly who'd sent it. The rustlers weren't faceless bandits. They were led by a man named Jericho Kane, a former cattle baron who'd fallen on hard times and turned to a darker path. Once a respected figure in Laramie, Jericho had owned half the county before gambling debts and bad investments stripped him bare. Bitter and broken, he'd gathered a crew of outcasts, men with nothing left to lose, and turned to rustling, robbing the very ranchers he'd once called neighbors. Amos had crossed paths with Jericho years ago, when they'd both bid on the same stretch of land. Amos had won, and Jericho had never forgotten it. The bad blood between them simmered, and now, it seemed, Jericho had found a way to settle the score. Amos's hands clenched into fists as he stood over Mara's body, his mind racing. He could ride into town, appeal to the sheriff, but the law in Laramie was as thin as the paper it was written on. Justice out here was a man's own making, and Amos knew what he had to do. But the thought of leaving Clara and Lily, of risking everything for vengeance, gnawed at him. He wasn't a young man anymore, and the weight of his choices pressed heavy on his shoulders. As he buried Mara beneath a cottonwood tree, Amos's thoughts drifted to Clara. She'd been his strength through every storm, but lately, her strength was fading. A cough had settled in her chest last winter, and though she hid it behind smiles, Amos saw the truth in her hollow cheeks and tired eyes. The doctor in Laramie had warned them it was consumption, and every day, Amos watched her slip a little further away. Lily, too young to understand, clung to her mother's side, her wide blue eyes searching for answers Amos couldn't give. The ranch was all they had, their home, their future, and now, even that was under threat. If the rustlers kept coming, if Jericho kept pushing, Amos risked losing everything. But doing nothing wasn't an option either. He couldn't let Jericho's cruelty go unanswered, not when Mara's blood stained the earth, not when his family's safety hung in the balance. That night, as Clara slept fitfully and Lily curled up beside her, Amos sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, mapping out a plan. He'd track Jericho's crew, find their hideout, and take back what was his. If it came to blood, so be it. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that this path might cost him more than he could bear. The next morning, Amos saddled his gelding, Jericho, not named for the rustler, but for the biblical city, a symbol of walls that could fall. He kissed Clara's forehead, promising to return, and hugged Lily so tightly she giggled, unaware of the storm brewing in her father's heart. He rode out with two of his most trusted hands, Tom and Eli, men who'd worked his land for years and knew the risks. The trail was faint at first, a scattering of hoofprints leading into the Badlands, where the earth turned jagged and the wind howled like a warning. For 3 days, they followed the signs, broken branches, cigarette butts, a discarded canteen stamped with Jericho's brand. Amos's anger grew with every mile, but so did his fear. He'd seen what men like Jericho were capable of, and he couldn't shake the image of Clara and Lily alone at the ranch, vulnerable. On the third night, as they camped in a dry riverbed, Tom spoke up, his voice low. He'd heard rumors that Jericho's crew was holed up in a canyon 20 miles north, a place called Devil's Jaw, where the rocks formed a natural fortress. It was a death trap for anyone foolish enough to ride in alone. Amos listened, his jaw tight, and nodded. He didn't want a war, but he wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The approach to Devil's Jaw was a descent into hell itself. The canyon walls rose like the teeth of some ancient beast, sharp and unyielding, blocking out the sun. Amos and his men moved carefully, their horses picking through the rocky terrain as the air grew thick with tension. They spotted signs of life, smoke curling from a hidden campfire, the faint whinny of a horse. Amos's heart thudded as he dismounted, signaling Tom and Eli to stay low. He crept forward, his rifle steady in his hands, and peered through a gap in the rocks. There they were, Jericho's crew, 6 men sprawled around a fire, their stolen horses tethered nearby. Amos recognized his own stock, their brands unmistakable even in the dim light. And there, lounging against a boulder with a smirk, was Jericho Kane himself, his black hat tilted low, a cigar glowing between his lips. The sight of him ignited something primal in Amos, a fury that burned away doubt. But as he raised his rifle, ready to end it, a sound stopped him cold, a child's cry, faint but unmistakable, coming from deeper in the camp. Amos froze, his breath catching. He lowered the rifle, squinting into the shadows. There, huddled near a tent, was a girl, no older than Lily, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She was tied to a stake, her small hands twisting against the ropes. One of Jericho's men barked at her to be quiet, and Amos's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about rustling anymore. Jericho's crew had taken more than horses, they'd taken a child. Amos's mind raced, torn between the urge to charge and the need to stay smart. He signaled Tom and Eli to hold back, his plan shifting. Killing Jericho would be easy, but saving the girl would take cunning. For hours, they watched, mapping the camp, counting the men, noting their habits. Jericho was careless, drunk on power and whiskey, but his men were armed and restless. As night fell, Amos made his move. He slipped into the camp under cover of darkness, using the shadows to mask his approach. His heart pounded as he reached the girl, whispering soft assurances as he cut her ropes. Her name was Sarah, she told him, her voice trembling. Her father was a homesteader, killed by Jericho's men when they'd raided her family's land. Amos's chest tightened. Sarah's story was too close to his own, a mirror of the loss he feared for Lily. Getting Sarah out was only the beginning. As Amos carried her to safety, one of Jericho's men spotted them, and the camp erupted in chaos. Shots rang out, splintering the night, and Amos ran. Sarah clutched to his chest, her small arms wrapped around his neck. Tom and Eli covered him, their rifles blazing, but the odds were grim. Amos's gelding took a bullet, collapsing beneath him, and for a moment, he thought it was over. But then he saw Mara's face in his mind, her trust, her loyalty, and he pushed forward, dragging Sarah into a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. The gunfire faded as Jericho's men lost their trail, but Amos knew they wouldn't stop hunting. He bandaged Sarah's scrapes, gave her water, and promised her she'd see home again. In that moment, holding a stranger's child, Amos felt the weight of his own choices. He'd come for vengeance, but now he was fighting for something bigger, redemption, not just for himself, but for a girl who'd lost everything. The next morning, Amos and his men devised a new plan. They couldn't outgun Jericho's crew, but they could outsmart them. Using the canyon's terrain, they set traps, rigging rocks to fall, luring the rustlers into dead ends. Amos's years on the land had taught him how to read its secrets, and he used every trick he knew. By dusk, they'd whittled Jericho's crew down, picking them off one by one until only Jericho remained. The final confrontation came at the mouth of Devil's Jaw, where Amos faced the man who'd taken so much from him. Jericho sneered, his revolver gleaming, but Amos saw the fear in his eyes. This wasn't the powerful baron of old, this was a broken man, clinging to cruelty because it was all he had left. Amos didn't fire. Instead, he spoke, his voice steady, offering Jericho a choice: surrender or die. For a moment, it seemed Jericho might listen, but pride was his poison. He raised his gun, and Amos struck without mercy, his shot clean and final. Jericho fell, the canyon swallowing his last breath. When Amos returned to Creed's Hollow, Sarah in tow, he was a changed man. He'd lost horses, nearly lost his life, but he'd saved a child and reclaimed a piece of his soul. Clara met him at the gate, her cough quieter that day, her eyes bright with relief. Lily ran to him, her laughter a melody that drowned out the echoes of gunfire. Sarah's uncle, a neighboring rancher, came for her, tears in his eyes as he thanked Amos for bringing her home. The ranch was battered, the losses real, but Amos felt a spark of hope. He'd face the darkness and come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger. He rebuilt, hiring new hands, reinforcing the fences, and planting a new cottonwood where Mara lay. The land healed, and so did he, slowly, with Clara and Lily by his side. The West was still wild, still cruel, but Amos knew now that mercy could be a weapon, too, a way to fight for something more than revenge. If this story of courage, loss, and redemption touched your heart, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Gentle Hearts to join us for more stories that remind us of the strength in kindness and the power of second chances. Before we end, I have a special request. Please share in the comments what this story meant to you, or tell us about a time you faced a hard choice and found hope on the other side. Your stories keep this community alive, and we'd love to hear yours.